The year 1101 was not a year of hope, nor was it a year of triumph. It was a year of slaughter, of cities reduced to scorched bones, of men who dared to stand before the storm only to be swallowed whole. The faithful called it a test, the heretics called it a reckoning, and those caught between had no name for it at all. Only screams, only the ceaseless sound of war. It had been 2 years since Jerusalem fell to ruin, since the veil between worlds was torn asunder by treachery and greed. The holy city was now little more than an open wound upon the earth, a festering abyss from which horrors bled forth in an endless tide. The armies of the church, once conquerors, had been forced into retreat. They had sought to claim heaven's favor with steel and fire, but instead, they had broken the world, and from the depths of the abyss, something vast and unspeakable stirred. By 1101, the conflict had ceased to be a war between men alone. The faithful still fought, their banners tattered, their armor stained with soot and dried blood, but their enemies had become something else entirely. The heretics, once mortals who had turned their backs on God, had been reforged in the furnaces of the third circle of hell. The legions they now commanded were no longer mere soldiers, but abominations clad in twisted iron and hell-forged bronze. Flesh was reshaped into living weapons. Voices became the howls of the damned, and eyes that once wept for salvation now burned with an infernal light. The Levant was the first to bear the weight of this nightmare. A land already scarred by war now found itself drowning beneath a tide of ruin. Villages disappeared overnight, their inhabitants erased or worse, reshaped into something monstrous. Fields that had once fed thousands withered under skies choked black with sulfur. The rivers ran red with blood, not metaphorically, but literally, as entire garrisons were thrown into the waters by forces that did not know mercy. And in the heart of it all, the faithful prepared for battle. In Antioch, the last true fortress of the church, the streets swarmed with warriors both old and new. Crusaders who had survived the horrors of Jerusalem sharpened their swords alongside fresh recruits, men who barely knew how to hold a blade, yet who had been given no choice but to fight. Priests recited blessings over soldiers who no longer listened, their prayers drowned beneath the artillery blasts of hellfire mortars. The walls of Antioch, once thought impregnable, now seemed fragile beneath the weight of history, their stones shaking with each infernal bombardment. For the church, the war had become one of endurance. They no longer dreamed of reclaiming Jerusalem. They dreamed only of survival. Every day was a battle not to win, but to hold. And every night, they listened to the cries of the damned beyond their walls, knowing that the next morning would bring yet another siege. And yet, in the midst of this horror, some still clung to faith. Some still believed that the Redeemer watched, that salvation was not lost. Among the trenches and fortifications, warriors whispered of the 17 martyrs, men and women who had walked willingly into hell itself, seeking to bring God's word to the enemy. Their fate was unknown, save for the rumor that they still lived, entombed within brazen bulls in some infernal city beyond the veil. But even in whispers, their sacrifice gave strength to the weary, if only for a moment. But faith alone would not be enough. The enemy did not pray. The enemy did not tire. The enemy only advanced. And in the year 1101, they came in force. The world was drowning in war, and soon, the flood would reach Antioch. The war had long since stopped making sense. Battles were no longer fought for territory, nor for honor, nor even for survival. By the year 1101, the war had become something else entirely, an eternal grinding abyss that swallowed all who dared to step onto the battlefield. The faithful still clung to Antioch, a city that had become less a fortress and more a tomb waiting to be filled. Its walls, cracked and worn, bore the scars of 100 sieges, yet they stood. For now. Beyond them, the Levant was crumbling. The church had once held sway over this land, its banners raised high above the ruins of old empires. Now, those banners lay trampled in the mud, torn by winds that carried the stink of burning flesh and the whispers of something inhuman. The enemy had come in numbers too great to count. The heretics, reinforced by the legions of the third circle of hell, swept across the land like a living plague. They did not march in ranks or formations like mortal armies. They swarmed, they writhed, they consumed. Columns of infernal cavalry, their steeds monstrous and fleshless, rode down entire regiments of church soldiers. Great siege engines, twisted mockeries of divine craftsmanship, belched hellfire onto settlements that had once been holy. The faithful fought, but against such horror, their resistance was as fleeting as breath in winter. The first to fall was Tiberias. The city had been a bastion for the faithful, its streets fortified by makeshift barricades, its citizens armed with whatever they could carry. The heretics reached it in a tide of blood and iron, their advance heralded by artillery witches who chanted in tongues unknown to man. Walls that had stood for centuries were torn down in an instant, shattered by weapons built in the great forges of Tartarus. The screams of the dying filled the night, but worse were the silences that followed. By dawn, Tiberias was gone. Its people had not been slain. They had been taken. And in their place, new horrors emerged, clad in flesh that was no longer their own. Next was Acre. The city had been fortified for months, its defenders bracing for the inevitable. The battle raged for 3 days and 3 nights, each moment a descent into something worse than madness. The heretics unleashed their anointed, monsters in blackened iron, warriors who had been baptized not in water, but in the lake of eternal flame. They could not be stopped. Blades shattered against their armor, arrows snapped like twigs against their flesh. The last defenders of Acre fought not for victory, but simply to die on their own terms. Most were denied even that. The worst was yet to come. The heretics did not simply kill those who stood against them. Death would have been a mercy. No, they had something else in mind. As Acre burned, the victors gathered the survivors. The priests, the soldiers, the women, the children. All were herded like cattle into the city square, where great iron altars had been erected. And there, before the shattered remains of their own churches, they were given a choice: renounce the Redeemer and kneel before the princes of hell, or be anointed in their own blood. Many chose the sword, many did not. By the time the heretics departed, Acre was no longer a city. It was a shrine to something obscene. The church reeled. Their armies were broken, their strongholds turned to dust. Only Antioch remained. The faithful gathered what strength they could, calling upon allies from distant lands, summoning what warriors had not yet fallen to despair. The enemy was coming, and when they did, there would be no retreat, no surrender, no mercy. The Levant was breaking, and soon Antioch would be next. The year had already been drenched in ruin by the time the heretics reached the gates of Antioch. The Levant was shattered, its strongholds reduced to charred bones, its defenders scattered like dust before a storm. And yet, the war had not ended. Not yet. The church, bleeding and desperate, gathered what forces remained. The last great bastion of the faithful stood defiant, its walls lined with soldiers who had fought too long and prayed too little. There was no belief in salvation now, only the bitter resolve of men who knew they would not see another sunrise. The banners of Christ still flew above the ramparts, but below them, the faithful prepared not for victory, but for vengeance. The heretics came with the fury of the damned. They brought war machines crafted in the forges of the Third Circle, siege engines wreathed in infernal fire, and legions of the twisted and the lost. At their head rode the anointed, black-clad giants whose every step sent cracks through the earth, their war cries a chorus of the condemned. But the church did not wait behind its walls. If this was to be the end, they would meet it in the open. Thus began the first of the 3 battles of 1101, the Battle of the Bloodied Fields. The faithful struck first. They had no choice. The heretic vanguard had set upon the outskirts of the city, their foragers tearing through what little farmland remained, gathering the corpses of the fallen for blasphemous rites. The church could not afford to let them entrench. Under the banner of St. Eligius, the last cavalry of the faithful rode forth. It was not the glorious charge of ages past, not the shining lances of a righteous host. It was a desperate, ragged thrust, men and beasts alike driven to the brink of madness by hunger and exhaustion. But they rode nonetheless. They hit the heretic flanks with the force of divine wrath. The first lines shattered, the infernal ranks split as knights and retainers crashed into them, cutting deep into the corruption that had overtaken the land. Demonic war beasts were brought low beneath the hooves of dying steeds, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though victory was possible. Then the sky burned red. The artillery witches had prepared their answer. The heavens cracked as they wove their blasphemous rites, calling upon the unholy fire of their masters. The battlefield was swallowed in an inferno, the screams of the dying lost beneath the roar of flame. The faithful did not break, but they burned. Those who did not die in the first wave were left maimed, crawling through the bloodied mud, their flesh sloughing from their bones. The church's last cavalry was gone, the siege of the broken gate. With the outer defences shattered, the heretics marched on Antioch itself. The siege was inevitable, but there was no patience among the damned. The gates would not hold long, not against the sheer weight of bodies thrown against them. The defenders fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Archers lined the walls, their arrows tipped with silver, their quivers emptied within hours. Cannoneers manned what few guns remained, each shot finding purchase but never slowing the tide. And in the streets, the last of the Templars made their stand, their blades slick with ichor, their prayers little more than hollow echoes. For 3 days and 3 nights the gates held. Then the anointed came. The first one struck the gate with a hammer carved from the bones of saints. The second wrenched the iron doors apart with hands blackened by hellfire. The third simply walked through the wreckage, its armoured frame alight with blasphemous runes, its very presence enough to drive men to madness. The walls had fallen, Antioch was breached, the last stand at the Chapel of Martyrs. The city burned. Fire licked at the sky, the great temples of the faithful reduced to molten ruin. The streets were choked with the dead, their blood running through the gutters like a river. The heretics moved methodically, carving their way through what resistance remained, dragging the fallen toward the altars they had prepared. But Antioch had one last sanctuary. In the Chapel of Martyrs, the remnants of the church gathered, priests, warriors, the wounded, those who could still stand and those who could still pray. They did not fight to win. They fought to defy. The first wave of heretics fell upon them in a storm of iron and flame. They were met with cold steel and whispered psalms. The defenders fought in silence, their voices given only to prayer, their bodies breaking beneath the weight of their own defiance. The faithful did not retreat. They did not surrender. And then, as the final charge of the damned came upon them, the chapel doors burst open. The 17 martyrs had returned. They came clad in broken armor, their bodies wrapped in the chains of their captivity. Their eyes burned with a light not of this world, and in their hands they carried blades wreathed in something that was neither fire nor faith, but something far greater. The battle did not end in victory, but neither did it end in despair. For the heretics had come to consume, and instead they were made to bleed. Antioch did not fall that day. The faithful were broken, but not erased. The heretics withdrew, their losses heavier than they had ever expected. And in the ruins of the city, among the ashes of the Chapel of Martyrs, the survivors stood in silence. The war was not over. It would never be over. But for the first time in months, the faithful did not look to the future with dread. They looked to the future with fire.